Welcome everyone to this fifth Engage high-level lecture, a world of contestation and shifting alliances, what consequences for the European Union, question mark. My name is Gustavo Miller. I'm a senior researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at the University of Leuven in Belgium, and I'll be moderating this debate. I'm also replacing in this moderation our colleague Steph Sabatino, who unfortunately is unable to join us today. I'm very happy to fill in for her, especially because of the high relevance of the topic that we're going to be discussing. Engage, our project, is an H2020 project which investigates how the European Union can effectively and sustainably meet its strategic challenges through comprehensive external action. The project brings research-backed insights on how to enhance the EU's role as a more assertive global actor. On June 12th, the Engage project will release its white paper, a culmination of 3.5 years of extensive analysis and policy-oriented discussions with policy recommendations on how to recalibrate the European Union's strategic posture on the global stage. And a large part of this need for recalibration of EU foreign policy has to do with, on the one hand, shifts in alliances and power at the global level, and on the other hand, contestation of international norms, institutions, and practice. To discuss this changing global context and the EU's position in it, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Steven Everts, who is director of the EU Institute for Security Studies, that we know as EUISS. Previously, he served as senior advisor to the High Representative at the European External Action Service, the EAS, where he was also a member of the cabinet for Catherine Ashton and Javier Solana in the past. He holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Oxford, and I must add, Steven has also acted as visiting professor here with us at K11, teaching notably about EU-East Asia relations. So Steven will speak for around 25 minutes. His talk will then be followed by a Q&A. You in the audience can ask questions in the written format via the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of your screen. Please note as well that this lecture and the Q&A will take a maximum of 1 hour. So I do encourage people to ask questions as soon as they have it to make sure that you get an answer. Without further ado, Steven, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours, and I'll share the slides over here.
Many thanks, Gustavo, and welcome to everyone who's joined us on a Friday afternoon at 6 o'clock for this discussion. So I think that really shows commitment to the cause of making EU foreign policy work better. No, Gustavo, it's also very nice to be with you again after indeed in the past our cooperation at Leuven University, and also very much happy to be with the Engage project, which I know and I followed throughout a little bit, and I think it's super interesting, the work that you do, and I look forward very much to your recommendations and your white paper on how to strengthen, let's say, the EU's global role, make it more effective, more assertive. So it's all, I think, part of a shared cause that we have. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the strategic outlook and some trends that I think are shaping the international landscape and that we as EU need to confront. There are indeed a couple of slides that we'll go through that will have some visuals. I should mention that this is part of a project that we at the EUISS have been working on for some time, and actually it was published this week, a Chaillot paper, sort of a bigger, more substantive paper that we do from time to time, and it came out on Wednesday on contestation and a new dynamic driving global politics, and everybody is warmly invited to look at that paper for more details and more examples, and so what you get is a taster, but the details can be found elsewhere. But let's get started and delve right into it. The core of this project, if we can go to the next slide, was that we began as Institute to, like everybody else, and you and Engage and elsewhere, you have been doing this as well. We said, okay, what are sort of the trends that we see shaping the world? And if you try to survey a little bit the literature, and if you go around Europe, you read all the debates. I think it's relatively feasible to try to distill what is happening into sort of three mega trends. And the first is a shift in recent years from cooperation to competition, strategic competition. And you can measure this through the number of vetoes in the UN Security Council. You see it through the sort of arms races that are happening, and you see it through this weaponization of everything, and the war by other means. This is a power political world, as Josep Borrell often reminds us. The second trend that people often talk about, and I'll go relatively quick because this is quite well known, but I'm happy to go more into detail later on. But the second trend I think people know about, of course, is this shift towards polarization and fragmentation that people talk about. This has everything to do, of course, US-China strategic competition, which remains the sort of structuring trend shaping the world, the divide between the rise of authoritarian powers and how they operate ever more together and assertively. It relates to the global south or the plural south or wherever you wish to call it. And you see it around all sorts of policies that speak to this notion of fragmentation. The third mega trend are the ongoing transitions. There are a number of transitions, demographic, technological, AI, climate, as well as economic inequalities and changes that we are seeing. And I think that with these three mega trends, you get a first snapshot that if you ask people, they would perhaps point to. Now let's go to the next slide. If that's the backdrop, what then do you see as in terms of orders or visions that countries or different groups of countries are advancing? And again, we're still in the inventory phase, trying to understand what is happening. I think that it's fair to say that there is a group of countries, among which the European Union, which recognizes the trends we touched on a moment ago, but believes very much that our ultimate security and prosperity are best served by upholding a rules-based multilateral order. They're sometimes called, the status quo plus, but I want to emphasize the plus there. The plus does a lot of work there, because I think there is a recognition, and I'll come back to that later on, and perhaps it needs to be strengthened, and we can talk about it. But there's a recognition that the system, such as it is not effective, is not seen as sufficiently legitimate, has holes or gaps, there are issues that are not covered by the system. But there is a willingness to build a system of rules and policies and institutions to try to manage these. Then there's the Global East. First was the Global West, now we go to the Global East. This is the group of countries essentially around Russia and China, but not just, who essentially wishes to replace that system, not reform it, not replace it, with a power-based, more multipolar order. And then, roughly speaking, people point to the Global South, and for instance, this triptych has been also elaborated by Alex Stoop and many others. These are the hedging states, the countries in between, don't wish to pick a side, but are very insistent on demanding, and with a lot of justification, demanding more voice, demanding more status, and wish therefore the system to be reformed. And sometimes people call them the reformers. So you have the status quo plus, the revisionist, and the reformers. Again, I'm trying to capture a little bit the conventional debate, and then we'll move on to perhaps a slightly different framing that we advance. Now, if you try to plot these trends and these camps on a sort of two-axis graph, on the left, the liberal democracies, on the right, the autocracies, at the top, the rules-based international order, at the bottom, the power political and the multipolarists, then you do see, you can sort of roughly plot these three camps, the revisionists, the reformists, and the status quo plus. We can discuss very much whether the US is sufficiently well placed. I did this presentation also in different context and different settings, including at the European External Action Service with the senior management and others. And it was very interesting that people immediately said, well, are you sure about India, Stephen? Maybe it should be more to the left or to the right, or what about Turkey? And it's very good. And we can, as any classification, it is subject to debate. But I would suggest that this is a fair attempt to try to capture, in a nutshell, the conventional way of framing it. Let's go to the next slide. But, and I'll be honest, here at the Institute, when we try to summarize all of this and look at all this, we felt that it's no longer really capturing sufficiently what is going on in today's world. This idea of fragmenting, a fragmenting global landscape with ideological, political, and financial alignments and groups. It's there, but it seems to leave out an important dimension that we have recognized and diagnosed, and that's the notion of contestation. So we suggest, and that is for discussion, that perhaps it is time to adjust our mental maps and the prism through which we look at the world, and recognize that in addition or on top of this fragmenting world, we also have a contested world, a world of contestation, where you see increasingly countries individually and sometimes also collectively, sometimes ad hoc, and sometimes in a much more strategic, sustained manner, are contesting policies, contesting institutions, contesting norms, and also advancing alternatives. And we thought it was, well, maybe that's interesting to look into this. So that's what we did. And if we go to the next slide, we sort of started to build a research project and say, okay, maybe that's worth developing a little bit further. So we did a sort of a mapping of global contestation, and we asked essentially 4 questions. What is being contested? How is it done? Is it done peacefully, or is it done through violence? Is it done individually, or is it done collectively? Are there alternatives that are being proposed? And if so, how do they look, and how successful are they? And finally, what are the consequences for the European Union? Here at the UISS, we always try to not just look at the world and describe what is happening, but also identify the consequences and the policy responses that the European Union can give to these trends. Let's go to the next slide and give you an example of contestation. Normative contestation. They roughly fall into 3 categories, and I'll give examples of each of these 3 categories that we identified. The first category is normative, then is issue-based and territorial. We'll get on. The first is normative, is perhaps the most worrying trend internationally at all, which is the erosion of the norm of the non-use of violence to settle political disputes. This is arguably the bedrock of the whole of international society, enshrined in the UN Charter, which prohibits the use or the threat of violence. And what we see is a clear rise in the number of wars, in the length, the duration of wars, in the number of casualties, civilian casualties in particular. Now, the graph here at the top right, plots the deaths in state-based conflict. And you see a sharp rise after 2020 in the number of casualties. The one at the bottom plots, and this is important to understand and to differentiate between different kinds of conflicts. You have the inter-state conflict, is the red line on the graph at the bottom. Then at the very top, you have the intra-state conflict. And the one that is actually changing and increasing is the type of conflict which is called the internationalized intra-state conflict. So this is the proxy, the wars of foreign interference, the war where parties pick a side and choose and support this faction over that faction. And that is the type of conflict that is rising in particular. And we've all read books about how war was becoming a thing of the past. Pinker and others wrote about this, but regrettably, this is not the state. And we see in many cases a growing readiness by states to use force to get their way. And regrettably, this is also a bit like a cancer. It's spreading. The more people do it, the more and are seen as getting away with it, the more others feel that they too can. And you see this in the Sahel, you see this in the Middle East, you see it in the Caucasus, Azerbaijan. There are lots of examples on top of the obvious one of Ukraine, Gaza, and so this is perhaps the most worrying type of contestation, of the norm of the principle of the non-use of violence. Let's go for the next slide. We go to normative contestation a little bit and give an example on human rights. In the United Nations Human Rights Council, there is a real fight going on where the record of the European Union, which is what we're discussing here, to use that as a platform to name and shame serious human rights violations across the world, is increasingly facing headwinds. It's getting harder and harder. And increasingly we have majorities against. We lose more and more votes as Europeans in this format. And I'll give other examples. Here you see on this graph two examples, two resolutions in the Human Rights Council. One dealing with Sudan at the bottom left, and the other one on Russia. And what you see are different camps, and I'll try to explain. The light blue camp, that's us. That's the European Union. People vote consistently in a consistent way on human rights violations, regardless where they occur. Then you have a dark blue group at the bottom. It's another a group that consistently votes against. And then you have the gray that are the abstainers. And it's interesting that in these abstainers and the against, you see a lot of fluctuations. Some countries that vote they abstain on Sudan, and they vote against when it comes to Russia, or vice versa. Countries like Algeria, Malaysia, we have the UAE, we have Pakistan. These are the sort of swing states, and I mentioned them, especially them, because they are not often mentioned in the swing state literature. And I think that this points to a need to be to use a more granular approach when it comes to talking about hedgers and swing states. Let's go to another example in the next slide of another battle that's going on, a contestation battle, and that is the contestation around cyber norms. There is, in the UN context, there are essentially two proposals. There's on the left side is the program of action. It's an approach on how to regulate state behavior when it comes to cyber technologies and ICT technologies. And then on the right is the open-ended working group. And again, and the good news here is that unlike in the Human Rights Council, we have a solid majority. We as EU and others, we support the program of action. But we are faced with an alternative proposal backed principally by Russia and China. And what you see again are a number of countries that vote in different ways. So on the dark blue block, maybe the easiest way to illustrate this fight is to go to the open-ended working group. Who votes in favor and who votes against that? The OECD world, us, we oppose the Chinese and Russia-inspired open-ended working group. But then there are abstainers like Chile or Serbia. So Chile and Serbia, they vote with us on the program of action, but they don't vote against the open-ended working group. There are also people who vote for both sides. They don't want to choose. They say, I'm in favor of this, but I'm also in favor of that. And that's countries like Ethiopia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Iran, by the way, and China, of course. So that is an interesting set of countries. And then there are also countries who just avoid picking a side, and they don't vote at all. It's Cameroon, Kenya, Nigeria, North Macedonia at the bottom. So anyway, just to illustrate this fight at the UN and how EU is faring, and to what extent countries support us or not. Let's go to the next slide. In view of the time, I will go a little bit faster. I mentioned earlier that for us, conceptually, there's a difference between fragmentation and contestation. And contestation is also around this notion of building alternatives. And I think perhaps the most salient example that we can give is the BRICS, where there is, a real attempt not just to meet and not just to advance certain ideas, which is perfectly legitimate, to advance certain ideas and principles in existing multilateral fora in the UN, the IMF, World Bank, but also to build amongst themselves a rival world. And what we try to plot here are, some examples of alternatives. There's the BRICS Bank. There's called the New Development Bank. So there's the World Bank, and since 2012, there's also the New Development Bank, or also known as the BRICS Bank. There is an existing reserve currency arrangement among participating countries. There's work underway, not to extent that people know this, but there's work underway on a rating agency. Not happy with the sort of dominance of S&P and Fitch and Western rating agencies. The BRICS are working on their own rating agencies. Not satisfied with the dominance in media landscape of the BBC and the CNN, so the Western major broadcasters, there's now this thing called BRICS TV. A lot of Russian propaganda pumped out through that channel. There are talks, there's nothing yet, on a common BRICS currency. This will take a long time, I think. But we should be aware, I think, that there is a real drive behind this. Oftentimes in Europe or sometimes elsewhere, people say, yeah, but Stephen, the BRICS are so divided, and they're getting more divided, and they are through enlargement, BRICS enlargement, the BRICS Plus, because there are now more, let's say, also historic rivalries within the BRICS. For now, the principal rivalry among the BRICS was China versus India, probably. But now we have also Iran and the UAE and KSA, Saudi Arabia. Or we have Egypt and Ethiopia. These are not necessarily the most, let's say, countries with the best of relations among them. This is true. But at the same time, I think it will be an analytical mistake and a political mistake for the European Union to underestimate the degree of drive behind the BRICS. I think we should take it very seriously and develop strategies, and we can talk a little bit about what that would entail. Again, we move on to the next slide, which talks about taxation. Again, this is in the debate you don't hear so often, at least not in my world. People don't talk so much about this. But again, this is important for Europeans to realize that at the UN, there was a vote, and the picture that you see, it displays the outcome of the vote. In the dark blue are the countries, and it's us, plus the US and Australia, Japan, it's the classic Western world, on whether you believed the best format for handling global taxation cooperation is the OECD plan on the minimum taxation of sorry, I'm blocked on the minimum taxation of corporates. Or whether you believe, and that's the light blue set of countries, says no, this is something for the UN. We should regulate the minimum taxation not on the basis of the OECD proposal. No, we should do this in the UN context. And we should also aim at a binding instrument as the desired result. And this came to a vote in November last year, and there was a resounding defeat for the West. And I think that this is important for, again, for European policymakers to be aware that this is increasingly the sense of direction that you have in the UN context and perhaps elsewhere as well. Let's go to an issue-based contestation that perhaps people are more familiar with, and that's the climate one. We wanted to try to capture a bit sort of the discussion on climate justice and plot in a single graph, let's say, the historic responsibilities that countries have for CO2 emissions. So that's the color coding. So the darker you are, the more responsibility you had for what is the share of global cumulative CO2 emissions. And at the same time, we wanted to contrast that with, but who is most affected by climate change? On the one hand, are the countries who are causing the problem, and on the other side are the countries who are most vulnerable. And the countries that you see that are mentioned here are the 15 most vulnerable countries to the effects of climate change. And this may help to express a little bit the politics around climate funding, climate finance, loss and damage, and the whole discussions that we had at several COPs about who's going to pay for it and how to do that. So this is the global battle for that. Let's go to a few more, and then we'll try to wrap it up, and then we'll bring it to the Q&A. When you talk about contestation, and you then say, okay, but what about Asia and Taiwan? And then we have examples also elsewhere, and I think many people will probably have seen graphs around the South China Sea or the East China Sea, and scenarios for wars and possible conflicts around that, and the 9-dash line. And okay, in this case, we wanted to give you perhaps another a map. And here in this map, you see a little bit the patterns of investment by China and India, respectively, red and blue, where China is rapidly increasing its investment in port facilities across the Indian Ocean. And as a response to that, you see also India ramping up its investment. But it's important, I think, to realize that some of the investments are purely of a military nature in Djibouti and elsewhere, but that China is also heavily investing in non-military port facilities, including in places like Australia, where people are perhaps not often so cited. I mean, the Sri Lanka case is emblematic, but it's interesting to see what is happening across the Indian Ocean, which is increasingly a sphere of contestation and mushrooming investment around the Indian Ocean. Okay, let's go now try to put all this together. What do we see? Well, we see that there are different types of contestation, and they take also increasingly, or in part, an aggregate form. And we do see across these different issues, certain countries do coalesce and can be found as contesters, different shapes and forms, across different examples. At the same time, I think it's important that we don't lump everything together, and that we fall for maybe facile but erroneous black and white schemes. And in particular, it's important to distinguish between different types of contestation, whether it's normative or issue-based, whether it's regional or whether it's global. This, I think, is important for EU policymakers. We go to the next slide. We can have some inklings or some suggestions for what the European Union should do. I think we should try to strive for a balance between working to save the UN framework and save the multilateralism at the 196 countries, with more plurilateral and more issue-based partnership. And I think that balance, frankly speaking, is shifting. It's for discussion to how fast and how far it shifts, but the rate of return is probably greater on plurilateral and issue-based partnerships these days than fighting in the UN arena, where there's increasingly an inbuilt majority against the positions advocated by the European Union. But this is something for further discussion. The second balance that we need to strike is upholding existing norms. There are certain norms on which we cannot cede ground. And the non-use of violence, my book also the universality of human rights, with at the same time more innovation, norm innovation, and probably a signal from us that we are ready to do that. In the sphere of cyber, perhaps, and certainly in the global justice area. On taxation or on climate finance, I think the European Union, it would suit us well if we adopted a posture of greater openness towards norm development and innovation. But we need to balance this because there are other norms on which we don't want to innovate, frankly, at all. Others do, and it's about holding the line against those attempts. So, but this is not so easy. This is not so easy, also in communication terms, because are we upholding? Are we reforming? Are we doing both? And in the debates, a lot of this stuff gets lumped together, and this is not so easy to differentiate. Okay. The third thing, perhaps, is to say that we should avoid, I think, a sort of a drift into anything goes transactionalism. It's very popular these days. This is a world of deals. Everybody does deals. I think as European Union, we have to stand for partnerships. And partnerships is not the same as doing deals. Doing deals is, an exchange on today. I give you this, you give me that. A partnership is about building the future together. And also it contains a temporal notion that I will be there with you in the future as well. And you will be with me in the future as well. And I think in the debate in the European Union, we need to get this balance right. And the pendulum is swinging, for my take, a little bit too much in the direction of deals and transactionalism. And it's very popular these days. Some of it is understandable. No, I'm not denying that. But the notion of partnerships, I think, needs to be retained because also given who we are 27 and these institutions, we will never be as nimble and as brutal in doing deals as some of our adversaries or competitors. So in life, you have to play to your strength, rather mimic the strengths or seeking to mimic the strengths of others. Let's go to quickly to the last slides. This we can maybe skip in view of the time. And we go to the final slide. So 24. How do we see this year? It's clearly a year of transition. When I go to Brussels and elsewhere, I hear a lot of, let's wait and see. We're going to first have the European elections, and then we're going to have a new team, and then we're going to have the American elections, and then we will see. And by the way, we have to deal with the urgencies with Ukraine, with Gaza, I think it's a little bit of a mistake. I think 24 should be an attempt, at least, and I think Engage and EUISS and others, I think we should try to play our roles in trying to make 24 a year of renewal, and not wait for the dispensation to come and then start working on agendas. No, I think we should, of course, harvest what you can and deal with the crisis as best you can. But I think we should also inject some new ideas on what we can do differently, on what we can do better, on how we fix things. And I think this project on contestation is an attempt to help us think through how the EU can do that best. And it will be, and that's my final comment, it will be complemented with another project on sort of 10 ideas for the new team on how the EU can strengthen its global role, which I think is also very much your thinking as well. So I look forward to that. So let me end here. A little bit longer than I'd hoped, but nonetheless, I hope that people were stimulating enough, and look forward to the debate. Please.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Steven. It's clearly a lot of work and effort behind the identification of the mega trends, as you call them, and then the assessment and the analysis of what that means for the EU, and more towards the end, as sort of a call for action, even already this year, right?
Yeah, of
So we
course.
do not have to wait for the results of the European elections, the American elections, and so on. I will still ask about those though. But first, let me start with a question on sort of identifying the weaknesses and the strengths of the European Union in this world of transitions that you say, right? You highlight competition, but also fragmentation and various types of contestation, acceleration of transition in terms of demographic, artificial intelligence, high technology, and also, of course, climate change, which is the creeping crisis in the background. To what extent is what makes the EU a strong actor to deal with these trends, and the opposite? What do you view as making the EU a weak actor in that? What are the strengths and the weakness for this new global order?
Mm. Yeah, tough question. Look, I think relatively speaking, in terms of the diagnosis, trends shaping the world, and everybody has a little bit, the words that they use are not always the same. But I do, when I go around, I do think that there's a relative consensus around these type of things that you try to summarize. I don't think people will contest the diagnosis so much. Where it's difficult is on the policy side, is the translation of what, okay, these are the trends, what are you going to do about it? And then it comes to who we are. We are a collective, we are 27. There are a lot of veto points in the European Union. And I think what the machine struggles with is to produce kind of policy packages that are needed at a certain scale and a certain speed, that are able to address the interest of a large enough numbers of countries or constituencies to swing behind that. And historically, that's basically the machine has been able to do that. And now we're being stress tested. And in some cases we manage. Yeah? I still think today, and I was working in the institutions at the time, in 22, when the full invasion started. I mean, I think honestly, we were breaking a taboo every day. And you saw the system capable of producing those kind of policy answers. I think can always quibble, should be done more this, should be done that. But now the story in 24 is more difficult. It's more difficult because some of the urgency has gone out of it. It seems. I disagree with this personally, because I think it's super important that we make sure that Ukraine wins, and not loses, wins. Ukraine must win. But what's the difference between 22 and 24? Is a sense of urgency that's dissipated a little bit. If you go to Gaza, it's obvious that the divisions are more significant. So it's trite, it's a cliche, but it's true that if you have unity plus urgency and agency, you can move. And I think there are examples where this has happened. If you have a division and a sense of delay, then it doesn't move. So I think that the job is to try to articulate those kinds of policy packages that appeal to enough people for the system to then be able to swing behind and swing into action.
Right. In a way, a simple formula, right, of unity, capacity, and emergency, and yet so difficult to achieve at times. Let me start with one of the questions in the Q&A as well, with asked in a way about how should the EU externally also approach the issue of the rise of the radical right parties, also rise of populism, which we see, of course, internally amongst EU member states, right? But we also see, and our audience asks here, we also see it in India and even in Argentina. How should the EU approach that? Is it still a norm to be upheld, the rule of law and democracy abroad?
Yeah, well, again, big question. And yeah, the degree to which the internal unity on that issue will also condition, I think, the stance that the European Union can take vis-a-vis others. It's no secret that you talked about this, Gustavo, yourself. And there, inside the European Union, there are quite a number of countries where the radical right is either in power or has a substantive say in the running of it, and that, of course, affects also EU policies, including vis-a-vis other more authoritarian or types of people in Argentina or elsewhere. And of course, the big shock is still to come, right? If Trump were to come back, I think, well, it will create all sorts of disruptions in all sorts of ways, and of course on Ukraine, as most people talk about a lot, or on climate, or on a number of substantive policy files. But I think perhaps overlooked and probably as great, if not greater, will be the change dynamics within the European Union, because those forces and those countries or forces will feel vindicated by a return of Trump to the White House, right? And so it will change also a little bit the conversation amongst Europeans, including in the country I know the best, the Netherlands, where there is a new government that is being formed as we speak, and yeah, you can well imagine that. Okay, the government agreement is sort of will remain constructive in the European Union. We're still going to support Ukraine, and we're going to be, quote unquote, good citizens. But you can well imagine that if Trump were to come back, that becomes much harder, and that will be then feed into perhaps the position of the Italian government, Slovak government. Hungary is probably already gone. So yeah, this is. But at the same time, yeah, we are a union of democracies. So this is the reality that we have to grapple with. And foreign policy is also very much conditioned by the nature of your domestic political setup. And if that domestic balance shifts, it will also translate and affect how we behave ourselves and how we are seen. Of course, it is a perennial issue. If you talk about advocacy for human rights and principles, I mean, immediately some countries, sometimes with their own agenda, and sometimes the agenda is also not so progressive. Some of part in human rights dialogues with non-democratic regimes from time to time, and they give you a long list of everything that's wrong in the European Union, including the rise of the radical right, and then you sort of wonder, yes, that's true, but sometimes they use it also to deflect. But sometimes it's anyway. Yes, this connection will continue to affect our foreign policy stance.
Absolutely. And I want to move on to sort of try to identify, in your view, as a result of the research that you have done at the EUISS, priority areas for the European Union in the upcoming years or decades, right? And here I'm thinking in terms of both geographic areas, but also policy areas. Perhaps we can start with the geographic areas, right? Because some might say that, well, the EU is perhaps has global ambitions, but at times might be stretched too thin, right? Trying to react and sometimes shape problems and issues all around the world, right? Is there perhaps a necessity in your view of prioritizing certain regions over others, and what would those regions be in a sense? So would it be the neighborhood? Should we also pay attention to East Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or transatlantic relations, as you mentioned? Does it make sense to think in terms of priorities as well?
Okay, I think it begins with our core neighborhood, and for me, the priority of all priorities is Ukraine. I think that is an existential issue, and if we call something existential, that means that it really has to rise to the very, very top of the agenda. And I think the link with the transatlantic there, I think we should prepare ourselves for real scenarios of a significant diminishment, reduction in US support for Ukraine. And this is something that we will have to be able to balance and put on our own shoulders and our own responsibility. Now, there is a wider neighborhood. It includes the Balkans, it includes North Africa, but not everything is the same there. And I think our capacity to affect outcomes and shape outcomes is greater in Ukraine than it is perhaps in the Middle East, because we are so divided, as I mentioned earlier. And I'm not saying it's less important, but I see less opportunities, perhaps somewhat, for the European Union to play the role that it can and that it should. I have a very strong belief that we, for all sorts of trends, and you mentioned them, everything you mentioned on climate, on demographics, on technology, for all these reasons, we need to probably rethink our approach to Africa overall. I think we too often put that in the box of a secondary priority. Too often I've seen it up myself often when there are meetings, EU, Africa, and then people don't turn up, and it never reaches the top. And I think it's a huge mistake. I think historically also limited the prism very much through either development or migration, and I think the time is really ripe. And they tried it, you remember, at the beginning of the von der Leyen Commission, and they all took the plane and went to Addis, and we're gonna the sister continent, and it all fizzled out. It all sort of, then COVID happened, and Ukraine and other things sort of took over. And I think that if I were to advise the new team, I think we need a radically much more modern approach to Africa, but backed by resources and backed by willingness to invest, including through visas and all sorts of things that are politically difficult, but I think would be one priority. And maybe the final one, because not everything can be, but it's my old patch. It's sort of East Asia. You have this circle. If you do sort of the south of China, and you draw a circle, and basically half of humanity lives in a very small patch of the world, and this is eventually the strategic center of gravity is moving there. And the big worry in Asia is, of course, that there is not a system that is sufficiently robust to manage the geopolitical competition between China and others, and that will affect Europe. To a large extent. I mean, if there were to be a conflict over the Taiwan Straits, and it's not excluded, not directly thinking of a military invasion, but it could be a blockade, or there could be other types of scenarios, it would really affect us in a very, very dramatic way. So Europeans must have the capacity to also be present in the region. And if you hear one thing from Southeast Asians and from others, is do not leave us alone with the US and China. There is a demand for Europe, and it's a demand that we're not meeting sufficiently at the moment. I know it's hard in terms of resources, and there are always choices to be made, but I think we cannot afford to ignore that region.
Right. And let me pick up on that then, because I know it's also your in a sense your area where you find most expertise, right? The relationship between Europe and East Asia. And in that sense, I want to bring also transatlantic relations, right? Because the EU has adopted an approach that is not the same as the United States, right, towards China, right? I think the EU has sort of grouped its approach into what we can call these days de-risking, right? And it has been, in a way, at least rhetorically successful, right? Because it has been picked up by other actors as well. Should there be a coordination, transatlantic coordination? Should there be more coordination in terms of how to approach the rise of China, or is it something that Europe has its own take on it, and the US will have a more integral stake?
Okay, well, you're absolutely right. Even the term de-risking, some people argue, has traveled across the Atlantic and it originated more, but I will leave others to judge that. But I think the way I would go about it is to say that there cannot be equidistance. We're not some sort of, really in between halfway house between China and the United States. Now, in terms of values, in terms of security interest, there is a fundamental difference between a one-party state and a country where, at least as far as the eye can see, elections will be held and there's a market economy, and we have a security alliance with the United States. But it will be increasingly, I say, important for Europeans to think on our own terms about what China means. We must have not a debate about China on US conceptual terms. And sometimes I think we're importing a lot because we read the same articles and I think we should be able to think about these ways as Europeans and make our own assessments and judgment, and that will include, indeed, from time to time, departures from the US stance. But of course, this is going to get harder and harder as US-China strategic competition intensifies and hardens. As the greater the tensions increase, for instance, over Taiwan, the more pressure there will come on Europeans to, quote unquote, fall into line. But I think we should try to, we have our own reasons, by the way, to be critical of China, and I am quite critical and aware of also the security implications and threats that also China poses to European interests, both in Asia but also globally. But I would still plead for Europeans to carve out space and capacity to think for ourselves about that. And maybe just to make a very concrete example, very concrete on ASML, which is a Dutch company that produces machines that produce the machines that make the semiconductor and the microchips at the highest end. And long story short, they're now limiting the most advanced types of machines, and they're no longer being exported to China. And this is part of a coordinated move with the US and with Japan and others. Now, there are some people who argue that this is a question of the Netherlands, quote unquote, falling into line, adopting a transatlantic approach. I have reason to believe that that's an oversimplification, that the Dutch did that because of their own worries in security terms of what China represents for Dutch interests, be it in Europe or in terms of global security. So it can also be that we still end up with the United States, and we probably, on balance, we will more often end up with the United States than not. But we should always make our own security assessment and make our own choices, and not follow necessarily just blindly if you do look at some of the debates in the United States, the notion of peer competitor, we don't consider ourselves a peer competitor to China, right? And the fact that that's seen as threatening or non-desirable by some in Washington doesn't have the same ring to it in Europe. So it's a tough one. It's a really tough one, and we're gonna, I think, we'll have tough debates. But the summary I will try to make is there are plenty of reasons to be more critical of China and to build leverage and capacity to push back also against China or to deny certain technologies to China. But let's always do that on the basis of our own strategic assessments.
Right. There is a question, perhaps we can address that briefly also in the Q&A on this very useful category, in my view, that you elaborate on internationalized intrastate conflicts, right? What I found interesting is that throughout the presentation, you did not mention one of the tools of European external action, which is CSTP missions, right? And both military and civilian. I wonder what you think about that. Is it still a useful tool? Because we haven't seen the increase of the number or of those recently. Is it still a useful tool to address, amongst other things, this what you call internationalized interstate conflicts, or should the EU be doing something else in response?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and we haven't spoken much yet on about CSDP. It seems to me that the growth area of CSDP is now a bit more on the European continent, and I think we should be honest. There are real challenges of these internationalized intrastate in the Sahel, for instance, or in other places where we've also been present. So it's now, I think, it's drifting more in the direction of supporting training or in places and building capacity in places where people invite us in. I mean, the biggest CSDP training mission at the moment is Ukraine, right? It's training of Ukrainian soldiers, and then I think we're still present in the Balkans, but I think we're on a declining path in the Sahel. So I would see that as the sort of trend. It's very hard for the EU to make a significant impact in the Sahel if the results are so poor, or if we're simply told to leave, as was the case in Mali. Now, there's another side, of course, of CSDP are the maritime operations, a different kettle of fish. With Aspides, we launched an additional operation. I think everybody still believes that Atalanta is very successful. There's this other type now, the coordinated maritime presence, which is in resource term a little bit less demanding, but so I foresee still growth in that. But indeed, there are also cases, and I'm an advocate of that. Missions also have to come to an end. At a certain point, you also have to assess, is this working or not? They're quite demanding in terms of resources. They're expensive. And let's be brutally honest, the outcomes that have been achieved, and not only as a EU, the UN, others also struggle with this, but with these bigger crisis management operations that we've had, we've seen in Afghanistan what the record was. We've seen in the Sahel what the record is. We've seen in other places. It's less good than you would hope. If you run, sometimes I say jokingly, if you run your health policy on the basis of that in terms of the mobilization of resources vis-a-vis the outcomes achieved, you're out of a job. So I'm quite in favor of having a very critical look at what CSDP and others, and again, I stress, it's not only the EU, it's not because they're done by the EU that we are struggling. I think that type of activity is extremely difficult. If you don't have functioning politics at the end, it all comes back to functioning politics. I'm a disciple of Robert Cooper, who taught me, foreign policy is about the politics of others, and they always care about it more and they know about it more than you do. And the role of CSDP, I think, I simplify things, but it's a bit like creating a space for functioning politics to work in countries that are fragile or subject to civil war or other types of conflicts. And we cannot do politics for them. This is for them. We're in a post-colonial paradigm. But if there isn't that political settlement, or if it's contested, like Sudan fell apart again, or across the Sahel, I don't see it. Afghanistan, the textbook example. I think one has to be also realistic at what can be achieved through these crisis management tools and what cannot be achieved. And sometimes the answer is not a very satisfactory one, but that it exceeds our capacity. And again, I want to stress it's not just because of the EU. I think the UN also struggles enormously with this because it's objectively very difficult to do in the absence of some type of political settlement that we can underpin. Then we can do the training and the justice sector reform and the different types of instruments all come in, and the longer term aid, and then okay, then we can do. But if that basic settlement isn't there, you cannot substitute it. Then can do thing, but it'll disappear again the moment you turn.
Indeed. So it's also about, in a way, managing expectations. About just one last question, Stefan. I won't keep you longer on a Friday evening as well. But you mentioned in one of the slides, more towards the end, that EU should still try to uphold and, in a sense, relaunch or create new momentum for the multilateral system, most notably the UN, right? And I wonder to what extent that can be done with the so-called hedging global order, as you call it, or the hedging countries, right? Are those still partners in this relaunching? Or and how can we actually bring them to this side, right? When it comes to, and here I'm also thinking about the slides that you show in terms of how they vote in the Human Rights Council, how they vote in terms of certain resolutions, right? It's a difficult task, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is a difficult task, and like everything in life, you have to look at the rate of return per hour spent, and what can be done. So I think indeed, given our DNA, and I think it's sincere, we will always prioritize the UN, and I think it's very deeply felt and sincere, our attachment to that. But I think it's also true that it's my personal take, but these fights in certain UN committees and Human Rights Council is an example. You have to wonder, is that the best way of trying to advance our human rights beliefs and principles, or is it more done through supporting Democrats under pressure in Vietnam, bloggers in UAE, trade union activists in Latin America, or my view, and it's not a scientific one, but my view is that the rate of return is greater on the second part, supporting people themselves who push for change in their countries, giving them money, giving them support, giving them training, giving them recognition, oxygen, whatever it is, rather than, in my view, quite sterile fights in over resolution this and paragraph that in Geneva or New York or wherever it is. Yeah, I think that is more. Yeah, we will get more done for our cause through that way than perhaps the traditional way. The reflex is to argue these resolutions, and because also in terms of basic votes, we're losing more and more. So this is not, I think, the best way to spend our time. Now, that's on human rights and things like that. The broader question somehow, but it's worth a seminar of its own, and we're not going to solve it today. But somehow the EU has to be better able to put together sort of policy packages with investment, with trade, with visas, with scholarships, with that keeps us relevant and attractive for the vast number of countries that don't want to pick a side, that societies are in motion and in change, and here we are quite Eurocentric, we're quite busy with ourselves, we're quite pleased with ourselves, and we typically say, okay, here's the plan, and I think that is one example, the CBAM, or deforestation, and these kind of things that alienates a lot of people. They're done for good reasons, high climate ambition. I'm very green, but we did sort of unite the world against us on that, and that can be the right strategic place for us to be. So, and it stems essentially from the fact that we devise these mechanisms to work for ourselves, and it's a tough job, and to have all the political and economic interest among the 27, and then the package is done, and you cannot change it anymore. And then we throw it onto the world, and we are surprised that the rest of the world doesn't automatically stand and applaud it. So this is the challenge. I think is a huge challenge and worthy of another seminar, which we'll reserve for another time.
We'll certainly schedule that. Yeah. Stefan, thank you so much for the reflections. This has been very, very insightful. This section will be available on the Engage website. You can already find there recorded webinars and high-level lectures on topics such as trade in geoeconomic times, the transatlantic relations, the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, space policy, also more recently EU-Africa relations, and much more. So I highly recommend visiting the Engage website. That's engage-eu.eu, and also to subscribe to the newsletter and be up to date in regards to the launching of the white paper. Dr. Steven Everts, thank you so much again for joining us today. It has been a real pleasure, and we hope to collaborate with the project again.
Great. Thanks a lot, Gustavo and everyone. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.